There is a moment when every person realizes they've officially become an adult. For some people, it's buying a car. For others, it's realizing they have strong opinions about lawn equipment. For Steve, it was the day he looked at an empty piece of land and thought, I could build a house there. Now, this is normally the part of the story where the music swells, the camera pans across the property, the sun sets behind the trees. A person imagines their future, a place to live, a place to raise a family, a place where they can finally stop saying, this is just temporary, even though they've been saying that for 8 years. Except there's one small detail that those inspirational commercials leave out. Before Steve can build the house, Steve has to build the paperwork. Turns out that building a house is the easy part. Building the paperwork, that's where Steve accidentally earns a master's degree in bureaucracy. Steve's dream is not complicated. He doesn't want to construct a mansion. He doesn't want to create a futuristic city. He doesn't want to build a house shaped like a giant boot, because apparently that's where architectural creativity goes when nobody's supervising it. Steve just wants a normal house. A bedroom, a kitchen, a garage, a place where the roof doesn't leak. A place where the neighbors eventually stop pretending that they don't know his name. A very ordinary dream, which is exactly why Steve is about to discover that ordinary things can become surprisingly complicated. Steve begins the process the way most people begin any modern project. He looks it up online. This is his first mistake. Not because the information is wrong, but because there's too much of it. Steve discovers that building a house involves permits, inspections, approvals, reviews, studies, regulations, applications, and documents explaining how to complete documents required to submit the application. The process is not impossible. That would almost be easier. It's simply a journey where every answer creates 2 new questions. And here's the part where things get interesting. Steve does not walk into a system full of villains. That would make the story so much simpler. Every person involved there has a reason for being there. Safety matters, planning matters, infrastructure matters, neighborhood concerns matter. Those are not unreasonable ideas. The challenge is what happens when every reasonable idea gets added to every other reasonable idea, and nobody is responsible for looking at the final result and asking, wait, what have we created? Steve begins with a folder, a simple folder, a folder that says, I have prepared. This is the folder of a person who still believes that paperwork has an ending. 6 months later, Steve no longer owns a folder. He owns a filing system. He has tabs, he has color coding, he has documents explaining other documents. He has reached the stage of bureaucracy where he is no longer building a house. He is building a small administrative civilization. And this is where Steve's journey really begins, because the question is no longer just, can Steve build a house? The question becomes, how did building a house become a project where the paperwork sometimes feels like the main structure? And Steve is about to find out. The first thing that Steve learns is that every industry has its own language. Doctors have medical terminology. Lawyers have legal terminology. Technology companies have terminology that appears to have been generated by putting random words into a blender. And government processes have their own language, a language where ordinary words quietly change meaning. For example, simple. In normal conversation, simple means easy. In the world of permits, simple means only requiring several steps, each of which will be explained separately. Steve discovers that the hardest part of the process is not completing a task, it's discovering what tasks exist. Because nobody wakes up one morning and thinks, I should probably learn about storm weather management requirements. That is not a hobby. That is not something Steve expected to discuss at dinner. But after a few months, Steve is having conversations that would have been impossible before. Not because Steve has changed, but because the process has changed Steve. Before the project began, Steve's interests were normal: sports, movies, weekend plans, the usual things that people discuss. Now Steve has opinions about drainage. Not casual opinions, specific opinions. The kind of opinions where somebody mentions rain and Steve immediately starts explaining runoff patterns. His friends slowly realize that something has happened. Steve did not set out to become an expert. The paperwork simply selected him. This is one of the strange things about complicated systems. They create accidental specialists. Most people never learn how a permit works until they need one. Most people never read a zoning document until it affects them. Most people never attend a public meeting until something important to them is on the agenda. And suddenly, ordinary people become temporary experts in subjects they never planned to study. Steve is not unique. Steve is just what happens when a normal person encounters a complicated enough process. Eventually, Steve reaches the review stage, which sounds promising. Review sounds like a final step, like a teacher grading a paper, like a restaurant manager checking a reservation, like someone looks at the work, approves it, and everybody moves on. But Steve learns that reviews have reviews. Because before a decision can be made, someone has to make sure that the decision is being made correctly. And before that person can make sure that the decision is being made correctly, someone needs to confirm that the person is reviewing the correct information. And before that, well, you get the idea. This is where Steve encounters one of the greatest mysteries of modern life. Nobody designed the maze. At least, nobody designed the whole maze. Each hallway probably made sense when it was built. Each door probably solved a problem. Each sign probably helped someone find their way. The problem is that nobody ever stopped adding hallways. Nobody ever removed doors. Nobody ever stepped back and asked, is this still the easiest way to get where we want to go? Because once something becomes part of a process, it gains a strange kind of protection. Not because people love it, but because people understand it. And replacing something familiar with something better is often harder than simply keeping something familiar. Steve starts noticing something else. The system is full of people trying to prevent problems. That makes sense. Nobody wants unsafe buildings. Nobody wants poor planning. Nobody wants expensive mistakes. The problem is that preventing one problem can sometimes create another. A requirement designed to solve one issue can create a delay. A delay can create additional costs. Additional costs can make a project harder, and suddenly the original goal, making something better, becomes harder to achieve. Not because anybody intended that result, but because systems have consequences. At this point, Steve has a choice. The old Steve would have looked at this process and said, nah, this is too complicated. The new Steve does something different. He creates a spreadsheet, a very large spreadsheet, the kind of spreadsheet that causes family members to quietly question whether Steve needs a vacation. The spreadsheet has columns, categories, dates, notes, references. Steve has entered the final stage. He is no longer trying to understand the process. He is someone documenting the process. And then something unexpected happens. Steve starts hearing the same phrase from everyone involved. That's just how it works. Not angrily, not dismissively, just as a statement of fact. A sentence that sounds harmless, but Steve starts thinking about it, because that's just how it works is one of the most powerful sentences in human history. It has preserved traditions. It has maintained routines. It has protected some very good ideas, and it has also protected some ideas that nobody has questioned in a very long time. Steve looks at his original plan. The house is still there. The dream is still there. But now there's something in between Steve and that dream. Not one person, not one rule, not one decision. A collection of thousands of small decisions that were made over time. Each one understandable, each one defensible, but put together, something much larger than anyone expected. The strange thing is that Steve started this journey wanting to build a house. Instead, he ended up learning how a community decides what can be built. And that raises a much bigger question. When a system becomes complicated enough that only experts can navigate it, what happens to everyone else? By this point, Steve has learned something unexpected. The process is not filled with villains. That would actually make things much easier. A villain would be simple. A villain could be defeated. A villain could be removed. But Steve has discovered something much more complicated. Everyone involved is trying to solve a problem. The inspector wants safe buildings. The planner wants organized growth. The engineer wants infrastructure that works. The neighbors want a community they recognize. The builder wants to build. Steve just wants a place to live. Nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, how can we make this harder? The problem is that every person is looking at one piece of the puzzle, and nobody is looking at the whole picture. And that is when Steve discovers the most dangerous question in any process. Not why, not who made this rule, not even can we change this. The The question is, then what? Because every decision has a second chapter, sometimes a third, sometimes a sequel nobody asked for. A new requirement solves one problem. Then what? It creates a delay. The delay creates additional costs. Then what? The costs make the project harder. Then what? Fewer projects get completed. Then what? The original problem is still there, but Steve starts noticing this pattern everywhere. A rule created to prevent a problem? Good. Then what? Another rule is added to manage the first rule. Also reasonable. Then what? A process is created to manage the second rule. Still understandable. Then what? Eventually, nobody remembers which problem they were originally trying to solve. They only remember the process. And this is where Steve has a realization. A system cannot be judged only by the intentions behind it. Intentions matter. They absolutely matter. But intentions are where the system begins. Results are where the people experience it. And those are not always the same thing. So Steve creates a test. Not because he thinks he has all the answers. Actually, it's quite the opposite. Steve creates the test because he's learned how easy it is for people with good intentions to lose sight of the person standing at the other end of the process. He calls it the universal government test. Not because it's complicated, because it's very simple. Just 3 questions. First, does this solve the problem it was created to solve? Not the problem from 10 years ago, not the problem everyone assumes it solves, the actual problem today. Second, can an ordinary person understand how it works? Not an attorney, not a specialist, not someone who spends their entire career inside the system. A normal person. Someone like Steve, before he accidentally became an expert in the things he never wanted to learn. Third, can a person affected by it actually navigate it? Because a system that technically works, but only works for people who already know how to use it, may have a different problem. Steve looks back at his journey, the forms, the reviews, the meetings, the documents explaining documents, and he realizes something important. The goal was never to eliminate the rules. Some rules exist for very good reasons. The goal was never to pretend every problem has a simple solution. Some problems are genuinely complicated. The goal was to remember the person on the other side, the person trying to start a business, the person trying to build a home, the person trying to solve a problem without needing a graduate degree in the process first. Eventually, Steve gets the approval, the call comes, the documents are complete, the process is finished. At least the process for this part is finished. Steve knows better now. He doesn't celebrate too early. He doesn't throw away the paperwork. He doesn't uninstall his document scanner. That would be reckless. But when the construction finally begins, Steve stands on the property and looks around. Months ago, he saw an empty lot. Now he sees something different. He sees every decision that brought him here, every concern, every compromise, every person trying to do their part. The process was not created by one person. It was created over time. And that means improving it will also take time. Steve never got the simple answer he was looking for. Instead, he found a better question. Because every system, every rule, every solution eventually reaches the same moment. The moment when someone asks, does this still work? And if the answer is unclear, there's only one place to go. Back to the beginning. Ask what problem we are solving. Ask who it affects. Ask what happens next. Ask, then what? Because building something is easy to understand. You put down a foundation, you raise the walls, you add the roof, you can see the progress. But building a system, that's different. A system is built one decision at a time. And the challenge is making sure that after all those decisions, there's still something left that works for the people it was meant to serve. Steve finally built his house, but somewhere along the way he learned something bigger. The most important part of any structure is not the paperwork, not the process, not even the rules. It's remembering why you built it in the first place. One thing you'll probably notice about my campaign is that I spend a lot less time asking whether an idea came from Democrats, Republicans, or Libertarians, and a lot more time asking whether it actually works. Because voters don't live inside ideologies, they live inside systems. And if those systems are making life harder than it needs to be, we should be willing to fix them, no matter whose idea they originally were. That's the conversation I'm trying to have. Not left versus right, not government versus no government. Just a simple question. Is this making people's lives better? If the answer is no, then what?